Okay, so thank you all for joining us today, and we are very lucky to be joined by Aleta Quinn, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Idaho and is currently a Fulbright Canada Research Chair in Science and Society. Aleta holds a PhD in History and Philosophy of Science from University of Pittsburgh and has completed fellowships at the Smithsonian Institution, Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Studies, and Caltech. And we are very lucky to have Aleta here today to tell us about objectivity and community science. Thanks, Aleta.
Thank you so much, and thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me. So yeah, here is my rough plan of action. So I first will very briefly describe what community science is, with more of a focus on introducing a case study, which will sort of recur throughout the talk and that I'll return to. The introduction will be fairly positive, explaining some of the benefits and reasons to be involved with community science. And then I'll be turning to some concerns that have been raised about it. At that point, I will introduce some models by which I intend sort of ways of thinking about community science, and there will be models of thinking about the functions of objectivity within the phenomena of community science, because that is centrally related to the concerns that I'll be discussing. Okay, so, and then I'll actually conclude by circling back to the case study and doing some of the history, which is the complete opposite of the way I like to operate. I like to do my history and then my philosophy, but I ended up doing it backwards in this project so far. Okay. There we go. So just first to get started, big picture, roughly by what I intend to mean by objectivity, I'm speaking about epistemic objectivity, what Heather Douglas has analyzed, and she starts with the sort of big picture that we mean something like, I trust this and so should you, whether you're talking about a person, a process, a method, a strategy, a claim, a theory. It can be a lot of different things, and indeed she analyzes 7 or 8 different things that objectivity can mean and argues that they're not reducible to any single thing, but the very rough idea is it's a claim about reliability. This is to distinguish what I'm speaking about today from any sort of claim about whether there's like an external world that really exists. That's not the sense that I'm speaking about today. Or as Koskinen has put it recently, we can analyze objectivity in terms of strategies to avoid or mitigate epistemic risk. Basically just strategies to try to avoid being wrong about stuff, about knowledge claims. Okay, roughly what I mean by community science is the participation of non-professional scientists in scientific research as researchers rather than researchees. So folks who are not professional scientists conducting some form of scientific activity, whether that's data collection, data analysis, contributing to methodology, something about the conduct of the research itself. And it can be many different things, can take many different forms. Some folks would like to use labels for different forms of what I'm calling community science. Also, some folks would say that community science is synonymous with citizen science or participatory science. Other folks say there's important distinctions between those terms and that there's good reasons to use one term or another. For purposes today, I'll try to stick with community science. Perhaps during the Q&A, we could talk about some of those potential distinctions, which is related to the fact that this is a really interdisciplinary project at this point, so that there are differences across literatures and disciplines in the use of terminologies. Also, by the way, related to the point that this is an interdisciplinary project, I apologize in advance since I'm sort of trying to speak to a lot of different audiences. Some parts of the talk might sound really, really obvious and old hat, and others might sound completely strange. And that's just sort of a feature of the current state of where we're at. Just to get things off the ground to begin with, I did a Google Scholar search for the number of hits, citations on each of these terms. And I think the little dip at the end is because I did that Scholar search shortly before the year was over. And so it might have, there just were fewer citations on citizen science at that time. But this is just to demonstrate that people speaking about this subject area has been on the rise recently. Now, my own engagement started, I guess it's been about 8 years ago. And I was in Los Angeles, and I fell in with some folks who were interested in knowing the distribution of 2 different species of salamander in the Los Angeles basin, which has important conservation ramifications, and which was not very well understood. So there were actually some scientists, professional scientists involved at this point, but there also were some non-professional scientists, and we went out and looked for salamanders. And they're only surface active for like 2 weeks out of the year because they breathe through their skin, so they have to stay wet, meaning they're only up when they're raining, which in Los Angeles is not a lot of time. So we had to get out there, and we found a bunch of salamanders, and we learned all sorts of things. We learned that one species is pretty much okay, like in the scrubby area behind the McDonald's or whatever. The other species needs like much more mature oak habitat, preferably on a slope, and that has never been bulldozed or had the ground otherwise disturbed. Which shows you right there, like if you're concerned about the population dynamics and the conservation status of these species, you might need different strategies. Now, another thing we found along the way was the organism that's on the screen right now, which is a Brahminy blind snake. It is a clonal lineage, meaning they don't have to mate. They're all female and they just reproduce. And it is highly invasive, partly because of that. And with snakes especially, and lizards also, for mitigating invasive species, early detection is absolutely crucial. And so it's critical to find them early. And this was actually one of the first, it might even have been the first specimens of that species discovered in the Los Angeles area. Don't quote me on that, but I know it was extremely early because what you're seeing on the main part of the screen is a map from a public database showing the distribution. Oh, there's another point over there. So there's two data points of that species at this point in time. Whereas if you go and look today, you'll see that there's very, very many data points. Okay, so I've been sort of sketching some of the non-epistemic benefits that can be accrued from the conduct of community science. As well, there's benefits in terms of organizing communities and organizing ongoing projects. In this particular case, what I'm now showing on screen is the distribution of a different invasive species. This one was a lizard. And these data points were noticed, and some folks with the Los Angeles County Museum, or the Los Angeles Museum of Natural History, organized a project whereby systematic surveys were done. So an organized system of surveying sites, asking for permissions to go onto private properties, setting traps, permitting processes, some training, regular monitoring. And for the first couple of field seasons, they were trapping just dozens and dozens of these things. But then after a few years, there were no more. So this appears to have been a successful control and an extirpation of an invasive species of squamate snake or lizard, which last I checked, this is one of the largest, most successful such efforts. And it was a community organization project in order to do that. Okay, so one of the professional scientists who was involved in both of those examples that I just gave is highly interested in the epistemic benefits that could be gained from community science. So he was interested in alligator lizards. He wanted to know specifically about their mating and breeding ecology. And he looked through all the published literature. And notwithstanding that this is a pretty well-studied part of the world, and some really like quite prominent herpetologists, people who study reptiles and amphibians, have worked in this part of the world for a long time, he found that there were 4 published records of alligator lizards mating, southern alligator lizards. So just 4 records. It's really hard to do any sort of data analysis with. So he, again, reached out, did some organization, basically had folks if you notice alligator lizards during the mating season, please send me your photographs. He's now got over 700 records. He's got photographs. And with that, he can show various things like the conditions under which they breed. He can show their behaviors. He can show that they take a long time to mate, that they'll do it out in the open. They'll do it at all times, which means they're vulnerable to predation. So again, there's practical implications here. And the photo of the snake, that is a California king snake that is eating an alligator lizard. And that's not my photo. All the other photos, unless labeled here, were taken by me. So I got that from the public database that I mentioned. This screen grab is actually a couple months old at this point, so there's probably many more observations logged there by this point. But what you're looking at is basically observations that are contributed mainly by non-professional scientists all over the world to this publicly accessible database. So if you went outside and use your cell phone, take a photo of something, there's an app to make this pretty easy. You can upload the information. You can adjust the location and toggle various settings if you want. There's a robot that will suggest an identification. It's pretty good, but if you post it, what will happen is people in the community, if your photo is decent enough, the community of online users will go along and check your identification. And if necessary, they'll get into discussions, ask questions, sometimes arguments, sometimes they'll argue about taxonomy. But what you end up with is this database that now there's over 160 million observations that is contributed by, sorry, the screen is blocking. There it is, almost 3 million observers and about over 300,000 people who are suggesting identifications. So the scale of the data is just remarkable. And this is not the biggest one. eBird has well over 1 billion, at this point, probably 2 billion observations. And there's other databases as well. So what you can do with this, there's tons of publications already using and citing data from this site, do things like study climate change, shifting ranges of things. But it's been pointed out to me by one of my community scientist friends that actually, if you look at the real potential, you should think about what this is going to be like in like 50 years, because it's only really just started. And the scale of the data is getting larger every year, more and more active participants. The type of question that you'll even be able to ask will be radically different once all that data is pouring in for a significant amount of time. So this really has enormous potential. And just one other example that'll raise, I'm going to be talking a lot about reptiles and amphibians. There's a reason for that I will eventually get to. But just to clarify that I think the points also apply to other cases, I will touch back to this example as well. SafeCast was a project originally started in connection with the Fukushima event, where the scientists associated with the Japanese government, or in collaboration with the government, were putting out analyses of risks from radiation. And there were some folks who are not professional scientists who became concerned about the decisions that had been made in how to analyze risk and how to present risk. And so what they did is they actually organized groups of people to go and take measurements and to have a platform that they put together to organize that data and then to disseminate that information. And so it started out in kind of I don't want to say adversarial, but in a reactive way, and eventually evolved into a story of collaboration that I believe it's James Wynn has a 2017 book analyzing at length. But it has the similarity that you're getting enormous scale data at this point, and it's an ongoing project and platform. But I'm interested in that suggestion of concern. So this, I'm not going to say who this is a quote from, but it's a quote that I overheard from a friend who is a professional scientist and who I trust greatly, and he's a friend, so he can say a thing like this to me when I was interested in this. So I have heard other expressions of concern. They're usually more politely phrased. I like my friend's bluntness because it tells me if he's willing to say that, likely other folks might be thinking that. And yeah, okay, he's probably overstating things, but you can, and folks have studied this in a more systemic fashion. So Elliott and Rosenberg had some funding to put together essentially a focus group at like a workshop. And they asked professional scientists and also folks who had been involved with community science projects what concerns had been raised. And they had discussions and they were able to analyze the general concerns into three main points. First, there was a concern that community science is not hypothesis-driven, it is stamp collecting. So as someone who, in my career, I have worked on taxonomy at great length, this is quite interesting to me. And I'll just suggest briefly that you can kind of hear the echo of the hypothetico-deductive model as the standard for all science here, I think. And I believe Elliott and Rosenberg, they analyze each of these concerns quite well. It's a great little paper. To which, of course, the answer is not all science and not all good science need conform to the hypothetico-deductive model. It need not be hypothesis-driven. There's reasons for this concern. They have to do with sort of sample biases in the data that you end up with. So I showed that map showing all those data points. But if you look at the distribution of data points, what you will find is that it's heavily skewed towards population centers, towards places with roads, and indeed towards places where people have the time and resources to engage in data collection efforts. So you're going to have, depending what question you're interested in, there's the potential that the unstructured character of the data could be a problem. That being said, there's strategies for dealing with that. You can fairly well predict what some of the biasing factors will be, and you can attempt to configure your analysis in order to take those into account. I will also mention here a point that was emphasized to me by Richard Rockman at Boise State University, which is that there's also an equity concern here. To the extent that there are benefits that flow from community science that are non-epistemic, those benefits will tend to go towards those places that have people with the time and resources to be pursuing community science efforts. And that is happening in various places. Okay, on to concern two. Concern two is very often raised that the data and methods used in community science projects are not high quality. And so I've heard that various places. It was reported in this workshop. To this, I'm interested in this question because it can be studied empirically. So Chuck Peterson, he's the one at Idaho State University who I recently talked to, had actually looked at all of the reptile and amphibian data points in the state of Idaho with this concern in mind. And he looked at the identifications, he looked at the locations and could tell like some of them were somewhat off. But specifically with the identifications, as a professional herpetologist with many, many years of experience, he compared the identifications suggested by the online community of users with those of his professional judgment. And he found that over 90% of the identifications were correct. And the ones that were questionable or wrong were the really hard ones. And he actually had to consult with another herpetologist on some of them, which impresses me because I like it when a method gets the easy questions easy, but I'm sometimes even more impressed when a method gets the hard questions hard, so to speak, because that gives me confidence that it's not some feature of the method which is reporting things with overconfidence. And that's just one example. There's other research out there in the literature that is studying this question and showing that, like, in many cases, you can get quite good quality data out of community science. There are also specific strategies for ensuring data quality and for checking data quality. And there are also arguments that the example I just gave isn't even the right standard we should be using anyway. I believe it is Karen Kavaka has argued that the better standard is fitness for purpose. Okay, so rather than expert accuracy, comparison to what a professional expert would do, what you want is to look at the purpose the data are going to be used for and see if the quality is fit for that purpose in many cases. All right, so concern 3 is that community science is not really proper science, it's advocacy. So this is where the concern about objectivity comes in. The concern is that somehow the inclusion of non-professional scientists will tend to introduce biases at an unacceptable level. And this is raised frequently. I want to even suggest that maybe sometimes a thing that's happening is if the professional has concern 3 about the objectivity and biases, sometimes maybe they will vocalize a concern about the data quality because frankly, it can be more polite than raising concerns about biases. Okay, but so what would we like to do? So here as well, a philosopher of science might hear the echo of another blob of philosophy of science, specifically the value-free ideal, as analyzed and popularized in discussion by Heather Douglas. Philosophers of science have largely moved past that, or at least many areas of philosophy of science have argued that we need to move past the value-free ideal. So we can look at where we've moved to. And here then, what I'll suggest is we can look at some models of the appropriate role of values in science and try to apply them to the community science case, or the cases that, specific cases that I've been talking about so far, and see what we get out. So I decided to start with Longino, her 1990 book, and then its 2002 revival and defense, and with some adjustments. The basic idea of the model is that to a large extent, not entirely, but to a large extent, objectivity can be a emergent property of social processes functioning within a community. So science is social, whatever else it is, it's social, happens amongst humans. That need not be the enemy of rationality. And indeed, the argument here, very roughly, is that if you have a community of inquirers that are interacting, and if it's a well-functioning community, then you can have a process by which claims are subjected to potentially transformative criticism. And that when this is functioning well, objectivity will emerge as a result of the criticism over time. And so she identifies 4 general criteria that we can use to look at the well-functioning of the community towards producing this transformative criticism. There are also sort of necessary criteria. She suggests, first, you have to have some level of agreement about what counts as acceptable criticism. So shared standards to some extent. There then have to be well-functioning avenues for the transmission of criticism and the uptake of criticism. This will, in large part, be the function of the peer-reviewed literature, including the process of peer review, but also the uptake and response. There has to be something that she initially identifies as equal intellectual authority. The idea being that in a way, it doesn't matter if it's a graduate student or a really famous professor who's making the criticism, the quality of the criticism should be what matters, but it's tempered, and that there is some role for expertise and also social standing. It can matter who makes a claim or who launches or responds to a criticism. And then the fourth criterion is communal responsiveness. Essentially, it's important that not just individuals, but that the community respond in this process. So if scientist A makes a claim, scientist B makes a criticism, points out they were wrong, something they didn't analyze in the data right, or whatever, scientist A might respond, yes, you were right, I'll fix that in all my publications moving forward. But if the community as a whole just keeps citing the original paper, then you have not had successful uptake of criticism. All right, so thought about this model, and I thought about what's happening with community science. And so I was initially thinking in terms of the criticism happening within the scientific community. Let's just posit that there's such a thing for the moment, where you could talk about a specific field, say herpetology. And then you have non-professional scientists who are on the outside, some of them looking in, and some of these folks might attempt to launch something into the scientific community. So that might be data, it might be a criticism, it might be an idea, and there's going to be some barriers to entry. There's, in many cases, going to be difficulty for that item to be uptaken. But in cases where the item is uptaken within the scientific community, you then will have on this model a process of dialogue discussion within the scientific community through which that transformative criticism might hopefully occur. And the pernicious influence of individual biases might be weeded out through this communal discussion. And I think this fits some things descriptively of what I have observed in my case studies. But I also observed a curious thing, which is that I lost track of who counts as a scientist. And so then I started thinking in terms of there being a sort of liminal zone. And here I'm thinking of actually folks I meet through my classes and in various venues, folks who in one context might describe themselves as a biologist or wildlife scientist. In other contexts might say, I'm just a wildlife surveyor. And so thinking there's kind of a professional liminal zone. There's also degrees and extents to which through more involvement in community science projects over time, folks are moving among this liminal zone of interaction with the scientific community. So I was thinking in these terms, and what this part shows that, you know, as a first step, over time, in many of these projects, and with many folks where they're professionally sitting, is that there's more extensive relationships and communications than just thinking in terms of scientists versus non-scientists. So you could try to capture this on a spectrum. There are some taxonomies of community science that function in terms of participation by degrees, and that might line up over time with this sort of model. It suggests that the boundaries amongst communities are somewhat more porous, so there might be more opportunity and more success in launching things into the discussion with the professional science community. It's also the case here that it looks like some of the criticisms might be launched in and be more substantively part of the process of critical dialogue. Here I'm thinking a case where a scientist proposes to split what had been considered one species, Lampropeltis triangulum, into 5 different species within one geographic area. Scientific proposal, folks read the paper. I heard feedback from a non-professional scientist to the effect of, hey, look, there's this one population in what is the putative contact zone between two things that this person's considering distinct species, but I think they're the same species because the population in this putative contact zone, morphologically, it looks exactly like the midpoint between those two other populations. And I noticed that their structurama analysis using nuclear data did not include sampling from that population. I bet if they redid their structurama analysis using data from that population, they might get a different result. And this dialogue was also happening within the professional scientific community. But so there I was observing, like, look, it makes sense for folks who know that particular population to have some input into this critical process. Okay. But at a certain point, I noticed I was missing something else. Oh, I do want to mention, I like another feature of this model, which is this other comment from one of my community science sort of case studies. He mentioned he never claimed to be objective. His project was objective. His contribution was objective on this model by virtue of functioning within a communal process of objectivity. You can still have a contribution to objectivity without claiming yourself individually necessarily to be functioning objectively, which I find fascinating. You can then talk about the ways in which the particular criteria can be negotiated across communities, how they can be extended, maybe adjusted, or maybe how they present opportunities as they stand. But the thing that I mentioned that I was missing, so I noticed that there was a very uneven distribution of contributions by the non-professional scientists. And it's not just me noticing this. This has been observed as a general feature in many cases of this type of community science. And so to give an example, I looked at all the observations of snakes in the database iNaturalist. There were about 1 million. They were contributed by a total of 250,000 people. So 250,000 people contributed at least one observation of a snake. But I counted up that the 2% of those 250,000 people had contributed 20% of all that data. And that indeed 0.05% of users were responsible for 10% of all the observations, and the top 10 contributors alone were responsible for fully 2% of the 1 million observations. So it's really imbalanced. You have a huge number of people contributing just a few or one observation, and then you have a very small number of people contributing huge amounts of observations. So I looked, who are these people? And there's Brian, and there's Jonathan, and there's Matt, and it's like, oh, hey, you know, I actually know these people. And I realized that they're a community, and they were a community before iNaturalist existed. And they're a hobby community. They're called herpers, which is like birders, but with reptiles and amphibians. So it's people who like to go out and look for snakes and lizards and salamanders and things. And they are a community. They speak of themselves as a community. They speak of the hobby. I have elsewhere described this as a practice in Alistair McIntyre's sense of that term. And it's pre-existing, the iNaturalist project. I also will claim it's an epistemic community. Certainly there are practices. There's practices of knowledge transmission. There's success conditions, and then there's strategies to be more successful at finding things, strategies to be more successful at identifying things, at collecting useful information, strategies to be successful over time. These strategies have all evolved. Some things get discovered, some things get tested, many things get argued about. So I realized, like, look, you could start to think about the functioning of this community in terms of the criteria for generating objectivity at the communal level. And they're instantiated differently, but there are versions of things that will contribute to this. There's shared standards as to what counts as criticism. There's avenues, the old Field Herc forum and the message board that existed before that. There's ongoing groups. There's also meeting places, and there's traditions, as it were, associated with those activities. There's mechanisms for reputation, sort of monitoring and transmitting. So there's kind of a system of like tempered equal authority, equal in a sense, you can produce the photo of the snake or not. The undoctored, hopefully, photo of the snake or not. And the community as a whole has changed over time. So I was thinking about that there and like, okay, well, that's interesting. So they have their knowledge practices. And then what you've got is, in this case of community science, what might be called platformed community science, where you have a stable platform for interaction over time. What you've got then is one epistemic community interacting with the other. And I drew the circles the same size. I don't intend to imply they're the same size in terms of participants or anything else. But that there's an intersection. I do intend to imply that each community is functioning with only a subset of community members participating in the interaction across communities. There's many herpers who don't interact with herpetologists, and there's many herpetologists who do not interact with herpers. But there's some folks who do. And so then you can start to think about how these standards might function when thinking about bridge principles or ways of translating knowledge across these communities. And over time, you will have the folks that are functioning at that intersection, whether you want to think about practices of translation or developing skills specifically at interactions across these communities, or simply just in terms of the negotiation of intellectual authority and reputation. You're having this emergence of these folks at the intersection that now are starting to have names. Here's a quote that was overheard at a meeting of the partners in amphibian and reptile conservation. This is a citizen science project led by professional naturalists. And you have various certification programs developing as well. The Master Naturalist Program, Ottawa Naturalists, where I am here, a club, some form of reputation, some form of community building as well. Just to reiterate my conclusions then, so I do want to mention in Alan Irwin's 1995 monograph about citizen science, he speaks a lot about expertises. In his view, the emergence of citizen science is actually fundamentally about the relationship between science and society in a very big way, in a very big picture way. I've been speaking more in terms of sort of bottom up from cases. I really appreciate that he speaks a lot about the expertises of the non-professional scientists. He seems to have in mind primarily geographic, local community expertises, the sorts of things you know by knowing an area. He doesn't say that explicitly, but his examples tend in that direction. So I want to highlight that there are various other sorts of epistemic communities, especially now that we have these online platforms and other technologies like digital cameras that really helped with the development of this story as well. So you can have epistemic communities that are not geographically located, but which have unique expertises as well. Again, objectivity can be instantiated in multiple epistemic communities via the same general sort of social process, but with variations in how the standards are instantiated. And that I think it's quite plausible that communications across these communities can promote objectivity within each community and ideally, when things go well, across everyone who's involved. So I'll only really briefly mention future directions because these are fairly speculative. I am interested in attitudes about the appropriate relationship between values and objectivity in science. I'm interested in expressions of that relationship. And my sort of working hypothesis is that expressing views about the value-free ideal or various forms of the value-free ideal that can play a function in facilitating collaboration. I'm going to continue working with my case studies, and because to a large extent, like I don't really know what is going to come out of that, because I didn't really predict much of this going in. And as well, I'm interested in further scrutinizing the concept of transparency, the trade-off that I briefly mentioned, and also transparency about intention. And there have been concerns raised about how the functions and goals of participation in scientific research are conveyed, particularly given different understandings of what science is and how it works. And so I'm interested in sort of ethical questions in that area, and working with some colleagues on epistemic nudging. But that, I believe, is where I stand or sit right now. So I just want to thank Andre and the other folks who are listed there have invited me to get feedback at very different forums and venues. So I really appreciate that. And then the second line is Sam is an academic scientist who has been very helpful to me in understanding and organizing and meeting folks. The others are community science friends who, like I mentioned, they were extremely generous in speaking to me for many, many hours and explaining how to tell the difference between a coastal giant salamander and a Cope's giant salamander, which is what we're doing on the right at the bottom there. Okay, and that's it. So I'll take questions.